So I'm Alex Durand. I'm CEO of a company called Saxonair. We're a UK-based operator. Among what we do, we run an FBO handling, but we're an AOC operator of jets and helicopters. So we've got a pretty good mix. We own one helicopter. We manage up to about 15 other aircraft. In my previous life, I've been on all sides of it, buying, selling, on behalf of ownership, on behalf of operators. So in this session, it's very much as the operator perspective, and just even accepting coming down has made me realise how ever-present this is. So things we're doing at the moment make this very real.
And my name is Eric Lewin. I'm the CEO of AIC Global Solutions. We're basically title and escrow on steroids. We're a closing platform based in London. We are transaction agnostic, so we do asset trading, corporate and commercial, and esoteric transactions. I am a recovering banker. I'm a recovering lawyer. So, I've got my problems. And I think, I've also spoken quite a bit and written articles, including my personal favorite, which is titled, "The Cape Town Convention is Insidious. The United States Should Withdraw Immediately." The other great idea I have, and I'm peddling this to everyone, is abolish VAT on all services. So,
is that how you get your hour?
Yeah. So I guess this afternoon we're going to talk about tripartites, and should we just give them the punchline? So that
go for it. Yeah.
And basically, they're an intercreditor agreement that governs the relationship between the competing creditors of the end user of an aircraft. So you can see that we're going to go through 4 slides. The aircraft sale and purchase, the financing for utilization, the financing during the tenor, and the tripartite relationship. What you're going to see is that tripartites exist only because a financing is involved. And I mean, from my perspective, as on the legal side, I think that the benefit of tripartites is that they cut through the complexity of competing and disparate legal and regulatory issues, and the various competing interests to achieve some practical consequences. Do you see any benefits to a tripartite before we get there?
As an operator, none whatsoever.
Okay.
But I can understand why they exist, and I think they are probably the only way of articulating 3 trapped partners who have completely different interests and trying to make them sing in harmony.
Okay. So basically, the whole thing starts with the acquisition of an aircraft. And if you don't have that, you don't have the tripartite. And the major issue is that aircraft cost money to buy. And sometimes, they definitely cost money to operate. They're depreciating assets. And sometimes the aircraft buyer, doesn't want to put his, her, or its cash up because they've got a better use for the cash. So they go to their bank and they say, "Hey, bank, give me some money to buy an asset that's losing value over time. But I'll make 50x on my money, so you'll love me tomorrow."
Correct.
There we go. So let me start by explaining how the diagram works. The black lines that are solid are privity of contract. So that's just the contractual relationships. And then the dotted line with the arrow is the money that the financier is paying to the seller. So what's going on here? The financier is selling money to the aircraft buyer. In exchange, it charges a fee, takes security over the aircraft, And it's really irrelevant what the form of the financing is, whether it's a secured loan or a lease or a conditional sale or whatever. The aircraft buyer becomes the financier's obligor. And the buyer either owns the aircraft outright or has a possessory interest in it. Either way, the buyer is going to have a primary obligation under the financing to operate, maintain, and insure the aircraft in compliance with applicable law, of course, and with whatever crazy stuff the financier imposes on the buyer.
Yeah, I think there's also an interesting point on timing, because we're talking about at the moment the purity of single buyer, seller, finance, and then when you get to the operator, there are also complications, those of you probably working with them, when the owner decides he wants a new operator. So probably don't get into that right now, but the timing of all these things is variable. Sometimes they'll finance after purchase. Sometimes they'll change the finance company before they get into it. So, but yeah, the basics.
So, here's the thing, is that more likely than not, the aircraft buyer is not going to operate the aircraft itself. And so there's going to be this parallel transaction, which Alex was referring to, which is the arrangement with the operator, where the aircraft buyer is the end user of the aircraft. And, the operator, basically on behalf of, what do you do on behalf of the aircraft buyer?
Well, you start with everything, and sometimes they may have their own crew, they may not have their own crew, but you start with the premise, throw the keys at the operator, and they do everything. And that's where different priorities. For an operator point of view, their focus is on everything that's required to operate that aircraft legally in compliance with regulations and whatever understanding they have with the owner. So they're sort of looking forwards and ahead at what they then do with the asset, whereas the owner is looking forward to giving them the keys and then going for a nice ride.
Exactly. And under the finance agreements, it's basically operate, maintain, and insure the aircraft. Those are the three buckets of obligations. And what happens, do you, Alex, charge up front, or do you charge in arrears? Or do you have do you even have a choice in the market conditions? And do you put money up for, subcontractors who you have to engage to do stuff to the aircraft?
You'll typically, if you've got it right as an operator, you will understand that you're an asset manager. You are not the rich guy. You don't have the cash. So you need to protect yourself from that. So a lot of it will be upfront. What do you want to do with it? What's the kind of activity that we're going to take on your behalf? So sometimes it might be they pay their own maintenance bills direct. Sometimes it might be through you. So you've got to have a really clear understanding of what the cash movement's going to be. And then you put in security deposits or cash flow deposits, depending on what it looks like. But very much, you talk to them about what they want to do with it, and then you protect yourself against that as far as you can.
So I guess you never find yourself in the hole.
Oh yeah, we do. We
Okay.
try not to.
So when you are in the hole, I can't remember how it works in this country, but I suspect it's similar to the U.S. In the U.S., a security interest arises by operation of law. So it's just the law says, hey, this thing happens automatically. And by the way, you, operator, are perfected, so you are a senior secured creditor. And by the way, if you hold the asset, like it's actually with you, and that's a subject of interpretation, but let's assume that the aircraft is sitting at your HQ, you are a super senior secured creditor, which means that your security interest sits above that of any other senior secured creditors, including the bank that financed the buyer's acquisition of the aircraft. Because it's policy that you want people to be able to maintain their assets and protect them, and you want to make sure that the people who do the work get paid. So that's how the waterfall works. All right. But I guess that leads to the tripartite relationship, because there is a potential conflict there. Because who's bigger, the bank or you?
I think we know, don't we?
So,
although, actually, sorry, one point which is what it's interesting to discuss, because the operator actually probably does have ultimate leverage, which is why there wouldn't be a tripartite if we didn't. So you're the junior partner in the transaction, and everyone wants to keep you that way, but actually, when it all goes wrong, you're the person that has full control.
yeah. Yeah. So the tripartite's kind of in my opinion, like, it's a descriptive name, but it's really not at all what a name that accurately reflects what the document does. I mean, it's an intercreditor agreement, because you've got two creditors who are both trying to get along in an uncomfortable relationship, or that can become uncomfortable if there's a default somewhere. Does anyone here have, other than the lawyers, I know, David, you're disappointed, but do you want an opportunity to show off your stuff? Okay.
We had an aircraft that was about approximately 30 days late paying for 7 months on the balance. Contractually bound, we had to sell the bank, as it was tripartite. I'm informed the bank turned around and said, you are going to pay the money that you owe to TAG immediately, or we withdraw all of your funds and stop support of your assets elsewhere, so that was including yachts, housing, art, etc. Because it was, the bank effectively said, we will loan you this jet, you've got to bring everything else with you, and in the tripartite agreement, this is all included. Suddenly went, oh, okay, I'll do it now. But it was just a little guy being the operator that didn't really have much sway with our email saying, pay us, and then it got to the point where we hit that cut in the agreement after 31 days of non-payment, you have to inform said bank sends an angry email, and then it suddenly all fell into place.
So basically, there's information sharing between you and the bank, and I'm not sure. I'm sure it's probably reciprocal, but maybe it sort of depends on each tripartite. And then it sounds like there's also a cross-default provision in the financing somewhere where they're able to, since we've got all of this exposure to you, deadbeat with a yacht.
Yeah. It was also effectively loose collateral, but it was.
Yeah.
I think he must care about the yacht more than his client.
I'm working on having that problem.
So, my question.
I have another question. Sorry, the operator, right? In FAA land, the owner is the operator. Where in the EASA world, the management company is the operator. So when it comes down to financing, right? Will the bank go to the end user in the US, the operator, or the management company?
To do what? When a default has occurred? They'll probably go to both. I mean, it depends. Again, remember there's this information sharing provision in an intercreditor agreement that allows the two creditors to communicate, and that because the obligor and the end user is consented to that information sharing. So, what else might there be in an intercreditor agreement if you've got creditors who have competing interests? Sure.
For both, or just the financing?
Well, is it the financier's business model? Let's assume it typically is a secured lender. Is it the financier's business model to own and operate aircraft?
No.
Yeah. So they're probably. Have you ever had a financier say to you, we'd like you to hold on to the aircraft for us, but we're not going to pay you to do that?
Yes.
How does that feel?
I think you can imagine.
So the financier is part of its package of remedies. So in the financing, they're going to be able to do things like repo the aircraft and dispose of it, and take the money and chase the credit for the shortfall. But, you know, the financier, unless its business is to act as, you know, maybe an operating lessor and they've got the equipment expertise in-house, they're going to definitely be dependent on the operators to do that for them. And so there's going to be a provision in your intercreditor agreement saying, hey, you operator, if we tell you in writing, because it's always in writing, that there's an event of default that has occurred and is continuing, you have to hold the aircraft for us. And then whether you get paid for that is another question that, you know, is subject to negotiation. Like, for the record, I have very little sympathy for financiers who can't afford to exercise their own remedies. If you're asking someone to do something for you, you pay them.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
Easily said, though.
How many other aircraft did you manage with the financier?
With sort of tripartites, I don't know, 15 over the years, not some, but it's a regular. It's different over the years. It's sort of, there's not, you know, there's a handful currently, but yeah, it's usually a mix as an operator. Some are. They're probably not so common in the UK. I don't know. I think they are. I think since 2008, I think finance has become much harder to achieve in the UK and possibly Europe. I think more credit leasing businesses have gone out of business aviation. So I think the habit of financing has definitely reduced. So that's probably why I'm seeing less of them. But back in 2006-07, everything was on finance.
Yeah. Well, the other issue is, recall that I was saying that there's this mechanics lien that arises automatically in favor of operators. You know, and if you're a bank, do you want people to be senior to you if you've got all of the exposure? Because who's got greater exposure just in terms of numbers? A bank that's lent 50 million, or, you know, an operator that, I mean, how deep in the hole would you get before you start to feel alarm bells?
Well, it depends. I think that sensitivity is, you can't cry default every time something's, you know, one day over your default terms. You know, you just don't have a relationship if you do that. So that's probably the hardest thing as an operator. And typically, whatever you've planned, there'll be a surge of operation, which has generally happened before you've quite twigged the knock-on on the cash flow of it. So it's a matter of, it's just knowing your client and having a relationship where you understand, and maybe listening to the credit landscape. If everywhere you go, you know, you hear about things, but it's a tough one really, because your focus is on operating the asset.
Yeah. So, but you would never get $50 million in the hole on it.
We certainly not.
Okay.
We've done a bad job.
Yeah.
And got very rich, which you don't get as an operator.
Mr. Hernandez.
Yeah, in reality, I think banks really need management companies, at least that's my perspective. Banks need management companies a lot more than anybody else. And so the deals that I've dealt with, particularly during the financial crisis in the South, you know, banks were really desperate, particularly all banks, including your former employer, were very desperate to make nice with the management companies. And we don't use tripartite agreements. We do the consents in the States. And the banks twist the screws via the loan docs and the leases. And I try to negotiate, no, we're not going to pay the fees for storage and anything like that in the event of default. But they never agree to that. And so that's the interesting thing here. It's, do we need a tripartite agreement in the States? But, you know, but they get it through different means. And so when you're reading these documents from U.S. banks, you just realize it's the exact same thing, just a different form of terms. So management agreements and management companies have a hell of a lot more power than they think in these type of arrangements, at least in the States.
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, why would you do anything for free? Well, actually, here, I think the tripartites take the form of a deed, which is pretty nefarious because you don't need consideration for a deed to be valid. So for those of you who are not lawyers, consideration is, I give you something and you give me something in return and we have a contract. In a deed, it's an legally binding obligation, but there doesn't have to be consideration. And that's why a lot of the security documents, if not all of them, from a a financier that's operating under English law, they're done as deeds, so they don't have to deal with the consideration aspect. So they can't ask you to do something for free, and even though there's a failure of consideration, it doesn't impact the enforceability, or rather the formation of that document. So it's a valid document, and you're stuck. So be very careful with deeds. Like with VAT, abolish it. Oh, you thought this was going to be boring. So we were talking about the order of priority of lenders, and so that really brings, to the other issue that gets, oh, that's fine, whoops. Sorry, I was behind my slides, can't count. But that gets to the other issue, which is, subordination. And subordination is an agreement between, creditors as to who comes first in priority. And there are there are effectively two different ways that subordination can occur. Just to keep it simple, there's who's a senior secured creditor and who's junior. And then the other way to think about it is in the waterfall, when you're dealing with proceeds that have resulted from enforcement, where does the operator sit within that waterfall? Is it, towards the top, is sort of transaction expenses that or enforcement expenses that need to get paid? Or are they is the financier gonna put the screws to them there too and have them be junior in the waterfall after interest and principal have been paid? I guess the other thing to think about is whether the deal is being done on the basis of assets under management at the financier. So one of the typical private bank financings, that may inform how both the financier and the operator negotiate the subordination provisions. And so I think, from an operator's perspective, knowing which banks lend and on what theory, can help inform how you approach that negotiation.
Yeah, I think that it's an interesting one because according to that map, it's an equal balance enforced. And indeed, the operator is the dominant control party when it comes to it. Couldn't be more opposite. And I think operators we should really take a more enlightened view of it. We are underpinning an arrangement for an owner. If the bank hasn't got confidence in us, it's not happening. And without going too far on that, we need to be aware of that and bring that in earlier than we do. Because typically what happens is we're furiously negotiating to win the management agreement from a competitor. We're starting to have an eye on the operation onboarding, which in the UK is horrendous. So we've got our headspace somewhere else. And then the owner says, oh yeah, I'm just going to finance it. Can you sign this agreement from the bank? And you say, sure, what does it take to make it happen? And really, we should have thought about all of that in advance and loaded that as we're doing the management agreement. But the trouble is, we've got a different job to do. And actually, the reality of that is if you put weighting on perspective, it goes all over the place.
This is unweighted.
Yeah,
it's just a simple diagram. So, cool. This is our fancy disclaimer. You can't rely on anything we told you.
Apart from the VAT claim.
Yeah, exactly. Get rid of that. It's terrible. On services. I don't care about goods. So, any questions?
You don't find though that it depends on the banks. Some of them are more friendly to operators. I mean, in the olden days, for the Swiss banks, we used to take Alex's operating deposit as part of the contract. If there's a default, you would give me all of the money that you're holding, you give me all the charter income, etc., etc. They don't do that so much anymore. It seems to have become a bit more balanced.
Yeah, that seems like overkill to me because it's contractual conversion theft because they don't really have an interest in that deposit because it hasn't been paid for the benefit of the financing. It's been paid for the benefit of his business. But that's why deeds are bad. Get rid of deeds.
I think that's true. They have got simpler. I think there is simply they're looking at the individual transaction asset, and I think it's strange how much it then relies on the operator, because what we're talking about is the owner default on payments to the bank. The reality is actually they're probably going to prioritise that, and we'll see as we discuss this later. But the reality is it's going to be the operator who's going to be calling it out. They're probably going to see the first signs of slowing down payments, and also typically the buyer or client we're working with is a serial negotiator, so they've already got you on the back foot. Whatever you've asked for, they've halved it to the point where you've just said, let's just give it a go. So you will start to see the bleed out fees. The situation we were talking about, that's by their fees not being paid. You won't necessarily see the bank side of that, and I think the owners will normally prioritise keeping the asset finance going. The flip side is you can use that as leverage, because you still do have your default clauses are in a good tripartite agreement. We've had one with a client where we didn't want to, but just to get ourselves paid, we said we're going to have to inform the bank, and then we got paid. So you can put elements of control in there.
Well, yeah, because I think the bank wants you to be paid, because if the value of these assets to preserve their value, they need to move. To a certain degree. I think it's no more than 400 hours a year.
Or if they don't move, they need to be maintained.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting stuff. We deal with a normal run of events. I mean, if you look at what happened after the Ukraine invasion, a lot of people were left holding assets that were never going to get paid, and they had contracts with the supply chain. And I know that puts some companies in unbelievably difficult positions very quickly. That's not covered by tripartite, though.
Is Ukraine a party to the Cape Town Convention?
But they don't charge
did it
VAT.
work? Because it didn't work in Russia. Can't remember. How many billions were taken in value because of the war? It's amazing. Well,